Go back to your scrapyard, Vivian Lockwood said, loud enough for every engineer, naval officer, and investor inside the hangar to hear. The words crossed the polished floor of Lockwood Maritime Technologies and stopped beside Ethan Mercer's 8-year-old daughter, who tightened both hands around the small brass compass that had belonged to her mother. Ethan did not answer. He stood beneath the white industrial lights in a faded work shirt, dark jeans, and boots marked by salt and machine oil, a canvas tool bag hanging from one hand. 50 feet behind Vivian, Sentinel-1 rested beneath a curved steel gantry, its white hull spotless, its autonomous guidance array glowing beneath glass panels, and its $12 million prototype frame surrounded by people wearing security badges Ethan did not have. He had arrived in an old pickup from Mercer Marine Salvage at 8:40 that morning because the invitation had named him directly. The guard at the service entrance had checked the message twice before allowing him inside. Vivian had checked only the logo stitched above his shirt pocket. She assumed he had come to collect discarded equipment. When Ethan stepped toward the vessel, she moved in front of him with the practiced calm of someone used to being obeyed. She told him the demonstration was closed to vendors. Ethan said he was not a vendor. He had been asked to examine the guidance system before the sea trial. A few engineers looked at one another. Graham Sloan, Lockwood's chief technical officer, stopped speaking in the middle of a sentence. Vivian glanced at Ethan's canvas bag, then at the faded salvage patch on his shirt. Her smile remained polite, but nothing beneath it was kind. She said Lockwood employed some of the best marine engineers in the country and did not need advice from a man who dismantled rusted boats for parts. Then came the sentence about the scrapyard. Sadie lowered her eyes. Ethan set the tool bag beside his boot and placed one steady hand on her shoulder. He did not defend his career. He did not mention the years before the salvage yard. He simply looked past Vivian toward Sentinel-1 and noticed a faint, irregular tremor in the starboard steering actuator. It appeared every 11 seconds, too small for the crowd to see, but familiar enough to make him stop breathing for one quiet moment. Across the hangar, the main doors opened and Rear Admiral Thomas Keene entered with 2 officers beside him. Conversation softened as people turned. Keene scanned the room once, saw Ethan near the restricted line, and walked past Vivian without slowing. Ethan Mercer, he called, his voice carrying easily through the steel building. I was beginning to think you would not come. The room went still. Keene reached Ethan, shook his hand, then looked toward Vivian. Keene reached Ethan, shook his hand, then looked toward Vivian. I asked that no sea trial begin until he had examined the recovery architecture, he said. Graham's face changed first. Ethan saw it. The Admiral had not explained who Ethan had been, only that the Navy had been waiting for him. That uncertainty moved through the hangar faster than any title could have. Vivian looked from Keene to the salvage patch over Ethan's pocket. Before she could ask another question, the steering actuator trembled again. 11 seconds later, it did it once more. Ethan's expression tightened. That is not vibration from the gantry, he said. Something inside the guidance loop is asking for control and being refused. Ethan did not look at Vivian after the Admiral spoke. His attention remained on the starboard actuator, where the tremor returned with the same 11-second rhythm, faint enough to disappear beneath the hum of ventilation and the low conversations beginning to recover around them. Rear Admiral Thomas Keene followed Ethan's gaze and understood that the silence was not embarrassment. It was concentration. 7 years earlier, Ethan had worked inside a naval research unit that specialized in emergency guidance and mechanical recovery systems for unmanned rescue vessels. He had been younger then, clean-shaven, carrying a government badge instead of a salvage yard patch, and spending more nights aboard test platforms than he spent at home. The Navy records called the architecture Tideglass. Ethan rarely called it his design. He described it as a promise built into machinery. When software lost its sense of direction, a separate path had to remain available to bring the vessel home. The principle was simple enough to explain and difficult enough to protect from cost-cutting. No digital system was allowed to supervise its own final safeguard. If the guidance failed, an independent mechanical path had to return control to a human operator. It used its own pressure line, its own release geometry, and a transfer lever that could function even if every primary display went black. Keene had seen the system tested during a winter storm off the Virginia coast, when freezing spray covered the rails and 3 other navigation packages stopped responding. Tide glass did not. That was why the Admiral knew Ethan's name. It was also why Graham Sloane had stopped smiling. 2 years after that test, Laura Mercer died and left Ethan raising 4-year-old Sadie alone. He resigned when long deployments taught his daughter not to trust that he would be home. With his savings and a loan, he bought Mercer Marine Salvage, where Sadie did homework in a converted shipping container office while he rebuilt equipment for crews who could not afford replacements. He rarely discussed his past. Machines did not work better because a man described what he used to be. Back inside the hangar, Sadie loosened her grip on the brass compass and looked up at Keene. The Admiral greeted her by name, then asked whether she still kept her mother's compass polished. Sadie nodded and opened the lid. On the inside, Laura had engraved 4 words before she died: "Always find your way home." Vivian heard that. For the first time, her expression lost its certainty. Ethan stepped closer to Sentinel-1, studying the cable routing beneath the transparent access panel. The wires curved around the control housing in a pattern he had drawn by hand years earlier. One line had been rerouted. Another ended at a sealed housing where a mechanical transfer lever should have been. Ethan placed 2 fingers against the glass. Graham told him not to touch the prototype. Ethan looked at the missing connection and said, quietly, "I did not come here to touch it. I came to find out why someone removed the part that brings it home." Ethan listened to the actuator again. The tremor was not random. It arrived 11 seconds after each digital steering check, exactly when the original Tide Glass controller would have verified that the mechanical path remained available. The software was still sending the question. The missing hardware could no longer answer. That meant someone had not redesigned Tide Glass. Someone had removed one half of a safety conversation and left the other half waiting. Vivian recovered before anyone else did. She stepped toward the access panel and asked Graham Sloane whether Sentinel-1 had ever included a mechanical transfer system. Graham answered without looking at Ethan. He said the current architecture was fully autonomous, built around redundant digital controls, and had no need for an outdated manual fallback. His tone was calm, almost patient, the way an expert speaks when correcting someone who does not belong in the room. Vivian accepted the explanation because she had heard versions of it for 18 months. Sentinel-1 anchored a $180 million Navy contract already weakened by 2 delays and a near-fatal board vote. Investors wanted a successful trial before noon, the Navy wanted proof in rough water, the board wanted signatures before market close. Graham had promised all 3. The reports in Vivian's briefing folder showed a success rate above 99%. Every major failure had been labeled resolved. Every warning carried a green approval mark. Vivian had accepted those summaries because Graham had delivered them on time and because the alternative was admitting that 18 months of executive decisions had rested on information she had never independently verified. Ethan walked the starboard side with his hands behind his back. The tremor returned every 11 seconds. The thermal display remained technically acceptable, but the housing was too warm for a vessel still on standby. 4 panel bolts showed normal wear, the 5th had a clean, bright edge. Someone had opened the compartment recently and sealed it again. Sadie watched from beside Admiral Keene. The brass compass held flat in her palm. Ethan stood and asked when the last full manual recovery test had been completed. Graham said the question was irrelevant because Sentinel-1 did not use manual recovery. Ethan looked at the transparent control housing again. Beneath the bundled cables was an empty mounting channel exactly 3 inches wide, shaped for a transfer lever that had been part of every Tideglass configuration he had ever built. The wiring harness still carried the old bypass route. It had not been redesigned. It had been interrupted. Vivian told Ethan that the vessel had passed 11 internal trials. He asked whether she had watched any of them from beginning to end. She said she had reviewed the results. That was not what he had asked. The room quieted again. Graham stepped between Ethan and the control station and said no outside contractor would delay the demonstration based on speculation. Ethan looked at the sealed panel, the uneven heat reading, and the actuator that continued to shake on schedule. He did not say the vessel would fail. He only asked why every person in the hangar had been told not to touch a system that supposedly had nothing to hide. Graham's expression hardened. Sentinel-1 has no manual mode, he said. Ethan looked directly at him then. The lie was not in the words. It was in the empty space beneath the cables where the missing lever had once been. Ethan asked Maya Ellis, the verification engineer standing near the thermal display, to place the actuator temperature beside the command cycle timestamps. Graham objected that she did not report to an outside mechanic. Vivian almost agreed with him, then noticed Maya had already opened the comparison. The heat rose 1/10 of a degree after every 11-second pulse. The increase was small, but perfectly repeated. Ethan explained that a healthy actuator converted a command into motion. This one was converting a rejected command into heat. The vessel is not confused yet, he said. It is practicing the mistake that will confuse it at sea. Vivian looked at the 11 successful trial reports in her folder. For the first time, the green approval marks appeared less like evidence and more like a wall someone had built between her and the truth. Rear Admiral Keane did not raise his voice. He simply asked Vivian to open the original trial records. Graham answered before she could, saying the archived data contained proprietary information and could not be released to an outside mechanic. Keane looked at him for a moment, then turned to Vivian. The Navy was not asking for a favor, he said. It was asking for the evidence behind a vessel expected to operate without a crew in open water. Vivian looked from the investors to the sealed panel and the repeating tremor. She granted Ethan 30 minutes, with no changes to the vessel without her approval. Graham objected. She repeated the decision once, ending the argument. Graham entered the room before she could. He told Vivian, who had followed them inside, that Ethan was searching through protected code without authorization. Ethan stepped away from the keyboard. Maya remained seated. Vivian told her to continue. The tide glass architecture appeared in layered modules, renamed and reorganized but unmistakable in its sequence. Ethan recognized the recovery loop, the mechanical bypass logic, and a timing structure he had written during a winter test 7 years earlier. Maya opened the author history. The original field had been erased. In its place was a later entry naming Graham Sloan as lead designer. No one spoke. Ethan looked through the glass at Sadie, who was drawing a small rescue boat with 2 steering systems. Then he looked at Vivian. The missing lever was no longer the only thing that had been removed. Maya then opened the environmental records for the same trials. Each missing 3-minute interval began when the simulated cross-current exceeded 18 knots. Below that threshold, Sentinel-1 behaved normally. Above it, the steering loop requested the absent mechanical verification, waited 11 seconds, and attempted the sequence again. The edited reports had not removed random downtime. They had removed the exact conditions the Navy intended to reproduce that morning. A harbor weather alert appeared in the corner of the monitor. The offshore wind had strengthened faster than forecast. The current inside the final test lane would cross the 18-knot equivalent within the hour. Vivian asked Graham whether he had seen the alert. He said weather modeling remained within tolerance. Ethan looked at the repeated gaps. The sea is about to run the test, your reports deleted, he said. Vivian waited until Maya closed the author history before speaking. Her voice was controlled, but the certainty that had carried her through the morning was gone. She asked Ethan whether he had come to the demonstration expecting to find his work inside Sentinel-1. Ethan said no. He had come because Admiral Keane asked him to inspect a guidance problem before the sea trial. Vivian looked at the erased field on the monitor and asked. whether he intended to use the discovery to claim ownership of the entire program. Ethan did not defend himself. He walked back into the hangar, stopped beside the starboard housing, and pointed to the empty 3-inch channel beneath the cables. He asked one question. Would she allow 12 rescue vessels to enter open water after removing the only independent system capable of returning control to a human operator? Vivian warned that a delay could end the contract and threaten 2 production facilities. Ethan answered that those consequences could not make a missing safety system less missing. Graham stepped forward and accused Ethan of using an old design dispute to embarrass the company. Ethan did not look at him. He looked toward Sadie, who had fallen asleep in a chair near the observation window with Laura's brass compass closed inside her hand. Keane told Vivian that Ethan had declined leadership of Tideglass because the position required months at sea and Sadie had already lost one parent. Vivian looked at the sleeping child. It was not trust yet, but she no longer saw a salvage worker who had wandered into her launch. She asked what he needed. Ethan said the mechanical transfer lever had to be restored, the bypass line pressure tested independently, and the missing 3 minutes preserved before anyone altered the system again. He also required a physical observer at the manual station because a fallback controlled through the same network as the failure was not a fallback at all. Graham said there was not enough time. Vivian told him to find the original hardware. He answered that it had been discarded. Ethan opened his canvas bag and removed a compact steel assembly wrapped in oilcloth. Admiral Keane had asked him to bring one from the earlier Tideglass platform in case the new vessel still used the original mounting geometry. The bolt pattern matched perfectly. Vivian authorized the installation under Maya's supervision and ordered a complete backup of the trial data. Graham stepped away and reached for his tablet. Maya looked at her screen. Ethan's temporary access had just been revoked. She said the change came from Graham's credentials. Graham claimed it was an automatic security response. Ethan examined the locked control panel, then the harbor doors beyond Sentinel-1. The sea trial was still scheduled to begin in less than an hour. Someone inside the company did not want him connected to the vessel when it left the dock. Maya created a temporary offline channel for the restored assembly. The first continuity test passed. The second failed for less than half a second, then reported green. Ethan asked her to repeat it without the automatic smoothing filter. A red interruption appeared at the 11-second mark. Someone had added a software bridge that imitated confirmation from hardware no longer installed. The vessel had been taught to answer its own safety question. Vivian stared at Graham. He called it a diagnostic convenience. Ethan called it what it was, a forged response inside a rescue system. Before Vivian could order another test, the operations director entered with a message from the Navy. The test corridor would close at noon because of worsening current. If Sentinel-1 did not launch within 40 minutes, certification would be delayed at least 6 weeks. Graham did not need to argue. The deadline argued for him. Sentinel-1 left the dock at 11:12 under a pale Virginia sky, its white hull moving through the protected test corridor while Navy observers, investors, and Lockwood engineers watched from the control deck and the glass operations room overlooking the harbor. Sadie remained inside the hangar with an assistant approved by Admiral Keane, the brass compass resting beside her drawing. Ethan stood near Maya's station with no active credentials and no authority over the vessel he had once helped make possible. Vivian stood several feet away, arms folded, eyes fixed on the live navigation display. Graham remained beside the primary controls, speaking quietly to the client representatives as though the morning's discoveries had changed nothing. For the first 6 minutes, Sentinel-1 performed perfectly. A Navy support launch followed 300 yards behind with 2 divers, a pilot, and a telemetry officer aboard. They were not inside the prototype, but their job required them to enter the recovery lane if the autonomous vessel stopped responding. It held course, corrected for crosswind, and completed 2 programmed turns within inches of the projected path. Applause almost began after the second maneuver, then stopped when Ethan looked at his watch. 11 seconds later, the starboard actuator trembled. The vessel entered the final autonomous sequence and received a command to turn north toward the recovery lane. The bow did not move. Maya repeated the command. The system confirmed receipt, but Sentinel-1 continued forward. Graham said the guidance software was recalculating. Engine output increased by 12%. Vivian asked whether that was part of the trial. Graham said it was an adaptive response. Ethan watched the distance marker between the vessel and the outer test barrier shrink across the screen. He said the system had lost directional reference and was compensating by adding power. Graham told him the vessel would correct itself. Ethan asked Maya to open the mechanical transfer channel. She tried. The access field remained locked. 38 seconds, Ethan said. Vivian looked at him. Until what? Until the vessel leaves the approved recovery zone. Maya searched the maintenance architecture while Graham ordered her back to the standard interface. She ignored him. Beneath 3 newer software layers, she found an inactive tideglass service route that had survived the redesign. Ethan gave her the sequence from memory. The first command woke the bypass controller. The second released the sealed hydraulic line. The third deployed the water brake system through the restored mechanical assembly. Sentinel-1's engine output dropped. 2 panels opened beneath the stern, creating controlled resistance against the current. The vessel slowed, but it did not hold its heading. The bow swung 12 degrees toward the support launch just as the offshore current struck the starboard side. Maya reported that the restored lever had released the hydraulic line, yet the digital steering controller was still issuing corrective pulses every 11 seconds. Each pulse reopened the conflict. Separate the digital actuator from the bypass, Ethan said. Graham answered that doing so would remove automated stabilization. Ethan looked at the support launch now crossing behind Sentinel-1. Then move that boat. The radio operator called the launch. No response. Its pilot was already turning away, but the current carried it toward the prototype's projected arc. One of the divers moved to the stern and reached for the emergency line. Ethan asked Maya for the raw actuator phase. The smooth display showed both steering channels centered. The raw trace showed the starboard channel leading by 0.7 of a second, the same delay tideglass had been designed to catch. Ethan told her to isolate the starboard pulse, hold the port vane at 8 degrees, and open the restored water brakes asymmetrically. A Navy evaluator warned that asymmetric braking could roll the prototype. Ethan answered that symmetrical braking would send 12 tons of white hull directly across the support launch's path. Vivian looked from the closing distance to Graham. He said the maneuver was not certified. She placed her hand on Maya's console. Execute Ethan's sequence. The port brake opened first. Sentinel-1 shuddered hard enough to shake the observation glass. The bow continued turning for 3 seconds, then the stern moved with the current instead of fighting it. The prototype passed 40 yards ahead of the support launch, close enough for the divers to see water pouring from the opened brake panels. Maya released the starboard steering pulse and deployed the second brake. Sentinel-1 slowed, straightened, and stopped 187 yards inside the outer barrier. No one cheered. The support launch radio returned with 4 voices confirming they were safe. Only then did Vivian release the edge of the console. On the monitor, the wake widened, softened, and disappeared until the water looked almost untouched. Vivian placed one hand on the edge of the console. Admiral Keene removed his glasses. Graham called the recovery an unnecessary interruption. Maya opened the command history. The manual lock had been entered from an authorized company tablet 4 minutes before launch. The device identifier matched the tablet still in Graham's hand. Graham lowered the tablet but did not surrender it. On the main display, a new security alert appeared. Ethan's temporary identifier had been associated with the manual lock command 4 minutes before launch. He said the device identification proved only that someone had used his credentials, not that he had entered the command himself. Maya asked him to unlock the tablet for a forensic copy. He refused and turned to Vivian instead. The vessel was safe, he said. The backup had worked. No contract had been broken, no equipment had been damaged, and there was still time to complete the demonstration before the signing window closed. Vivian looked through the glass toward Sentinel-1, motionless inside the test corridor while a recovery crew approached at low speed. Graham stepped closer and lowered his voice. If the command history became part of the official trial record, the Navy would suspend certification. Investors would withdraw. 2 production facilities could close before the end of the quarter. He said the simplest explanation was unauthorized interference by an outside salvage operator who had entered protected systems without valid credentials. Ethan heard every word. He did not defend himself. He stood beside Maya's console with his hands at his sides, watching Vivian rather than Graham. Rear Admiral Keane said nothing. He did not need to. The room had already seen who understood the vessel and who had tried to prevent that understanding. Graham told Vivian she had less than a minute before the automated compliance archive transmitted the full command log to the Navy review server. He could still classify the event as a temporary diagnostic interruption and remove Ethan's access sequence from the report. 40 seconds, Maya said quietly. Vivian looked at the investors, the officers, the engineers, and the contract folder waiting on the far table. Then she looked through the observation window toward the hangar, where Sadie stood beside an assistant holding her mother's brass compass and waiting for her father to return. 32 seconds. Graham opened the administrative controls and asked Vivian for authorization. She moved beside him. For one moment, he seemed relieved. Then she reached past the deletion field and selected the preservation command. She ordered Maya to copy the complete trial record to 3 independent servers, including the Navy Archive and the board's legal repository. Graham said she was destroying the company. Vivian answered that a company protected by erased evidence was already damaged. She suspended his system privileges, instructed security to secure the tablet without altering it, and postponed the contract signing until an independent review could be completed. No one applauded. Ethan gave no sign of satisfaction. He looked back at the harbor and asked whether the recovery crew had confirmed the restored lever was holding pressure. Vivian answered that they had. It was the first time she had trusted his judgment before the Admiral confirmed it. Maya continued reviewing the archived code while the room emptied around them. Several minutes later, she found a licensing directory hidden beneath 3 years of software updates. Tide Glass had not been copied only for Sentinel-1. Lockwood had used its recovery architecture across 4 earlier prototypes and 2 commercial systems. Every author field carried Graham Sloane's name. Ethan's appeared nowhere. Maya turned the monitor toward Vivian. The missing credit was no longer an old dispute. It was a pattern. Maya checked the authentication path. Ethan's identifier had not entered the command through his disabled account. It had been written into the log afterward by an administrative reconciliation tool. Only 2 people possessed that level of authority, Vivian and Graham. Vivian's token showed no activity. Graham's showed a 12-second session from the tablet in his hand. He said the session could have been automated. Maya asked why an automated process had also attempted to overwrite the local maintenance camera at the same second. The camera server had refused because Ethan had insisted the trial data be copied offline. His demand for preservation had protected not only the evidence against Graham, but Ethan himself. 40 minutes later, the emergency board meeting opened in the glass conference room above the secured vessel. The unsigned contract sat closed at the center of the table. Chair Helen Ward faced Vivian, Keane sat beside Navy counsel, Maya connected the preserved archive. Ethan remained near the end with Sadie and Laura's compass. Graham requested to speak first. Helen told him the evidence would come before his explanation. Maya began with the 11 internal trials. Each showed the same 3-minute gap before a system restart. She displayed the maintenance footage of technicians removing the mechanical transfer lever, then the command history showing the manual recovery lock entered from Graham's assigned device before launch. Graham said the records could have been manipulated. Maya opened the independent copies preserved on the Navy server and the board's legal repository. The timestamps matched. No one interrupted her again. She moved to the Tide Glass archive and showed how the recovery architecture had appeared across 4 prototypes and 2 commercial systems during the previous 3 years. The original author field had been erased. Graham's name had been inserted during a later software migration. Helen asked Ethan whether he could prove he created the underlying system. Ethan did not approach the display. He said the Navy maintained the original design records. Admiral Keene opened a sealed technical file and placed it on the table. Inside were dated diagrams, test reports, and Ethan Mercer's signature beneath the first approved Tide Glass configuration. Keene did not call him brilliant or heroic. He looked at the board and said, "When our systems failed, his did not." Vivian placed her pen beside the unsigned contract. Helen stopped turning pages. Sadie looked toward her father, but Ethan's expression did not change. Graham said Tide Glass had been government work and therefore Ethan had no personal claim to recognition. The Navy attorney replied that the issue before them was not ownership alone. It was false attribution, concealed safety changes, altered test data, and an attempt to erase an official trial record. Helen asked why the mechanical fallback had been removed. Graham said the weight reduction was necessary to meet performance requirements. Maya displayed the engineering calculation. The complete Tide Glass assembly weighed 31 pounds on a 12-ton vessel. Removing it improved projected efficiency by less than 0.04%. She asked why the board had not been informed. He answered that technical decisions did not require executive approval. Vivian finally spoke. She said hiding a decision that could change the safety of 12 rescue vessels was not engineering judgment. It was a leadership failure. Graham looked toward her as if expecting the years they had worked together to protect him. Vivian did not look away. Helen suspended him from the program and authorized an independent investigation into every system carrying Tide Glass code. Security escorted him from the room without noise or argument. The door closed. For several seconds, only the harbor wind pressed against the glass. Then Helen turned to Ethan and asked whether he would help complete the project the company had taken from him. Ethan said the first condition was that the company stop calling safety failures proprietary information when lives depended on understanding them. The second was that Maya and any future verification lead receive authority to stop a launch without executive approval. The third was that every trial failure remain permanently visible to the Navy and the board. Only then did he look at Sadie and say he would consider returning. Ethan looked at Sadie, then at Sentinel-1 below. He said he would consider it, but only if the vessel was rebuilt around the truth. Helen then played the full maintenance video recovered from the offline copy. Graham stood beside the open housing while technicians removed the transfer lever. His voice could be heard instructing them to preserve the original cable route so the system would continue to pass visual inspection. In the final seconds, one technician asked whether the Navy should be notified. Graham answered that the board had paid for an autonomous vessel, not an antique emergency handle. Vivian closed her eyes briefly. She had spent the morning believing she was choosing between one engineer's accusation and the future of her company. The recording revealed a harder truth: her company had already been placed at risk by the culture she had allowed, one where bad news moved upward only after it had been made harmless. Ethan returned to Mercer Marine Salvage before sunset and opened the yard the next morning at 6, exactly as he had every weekday since Laura died. The gate rolled back with its familiar metal rattle. Sadie carried her backpack into the converted shipping container office, placed the brass compass beside her homework, and watched her father inspect a corroded rescue pump that a volunteer crew could not afford to replace. Nothing about the yard suggested that a naval contractor had offered him a place in its future. Ethan intended to keep it that way. 3 days later, Helen Ward and Vivian Lockwood arrived with a revised agreement. Ethan read every page at the same workbench where he rebuilt old marine engines. He agreed to serve as an independent safety advisor, not an executive and not an employee under Graham's former department. Tide glass would undergo a complete validation program before another vessel entered open water. Every engineer who contributed to the original system would be restored to the official record. Lockwood would also fund a technical training center at Mercer Marine Salvage for veterans, working parents, and young mechanics who could not afford traditional engineering programs. Vivian accepted all three conditions without negotiation. Auditors later confirmed that Graham had altered attribution, concealed failed tests, and removed the fallback without board or Navy notice. He was dismissed. Maya became head of independent verification and rebuilt the archive so no executive could erase a failure again. Ethan attended every sea trial, usually in the same faded work shirt he had worn on the first morning. Sentinel-1 completed its final endurance test in heavy rain and rough coastal water. The Navy deliberately recreated the 18-knot crosscurrent that had disappeared from the original reports, then disabled the primary guidance array without warning the operators which cycle would fail. When the digital guidance failed, Tide Glass transferred control through the independent mechanical path before the next 11-second verification pulse. Maya ordered the test repeated with the thermal sensor disconnected, then again with the starboard actuator delayed by 0.7 of a second. Each time, the vessel returned to human control without adding power or losing heading. The Navy approved the revised system and signed the contract only after the safety review. Ethan skipped the press conference. He was replacing a fuel pump when Vivian arrived alone and walked past the new training bay, where apprentices worked while Sadie finished a science project in the office. Vivian looked around the place she had once dismissed and understood that nothing there had been abandoned carelessly. Every part had been examined for what it could still become. She apologized to Ethan for judging his work, his choices, and his silence before learning what any of them meant. Ethan listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said a scrapyard was only worthless to someone who could not see a second purpose. He did not remind her of the words she had used in the hangar. He did not need to. 1 week later, Rear Admiral Keene mailed Sadie a small brass plate engraved with the Tide Glass name and the original design team. She hung it beside Laura's compass in the office. At dawn the following Monday, Ethan raised the yard door while the first apprentices arrived carrying tool bags. He had gone back to the scrapyard. This time, everyone knew exactly why. Months later, Sadie asked Ethan whether he missed the laboratory he had left. He looked through the open workshop door at apprentices rebuilding a rescue pump beside a retired Navy engineer and a young mother studying after her shift. Sometimes, he said. But a good system is not the building where it was invented. It is what still works after the person who invented it goes home. Sadie touched the brass compass beneath the Tide Glass plate. The needle settled north. Outside, an old fishing crew arrived with a damaged steering unit no authorized shop would repair. Ethan rolled up his sleeves and opened the gate.